All right. Welcome to the Thursday, September 28th, Food Process Ontology Workgroup. And after the summer break, here we are. I think we can call this a bit of a planning session. We have one topic that Troy's bringing to the table that's connected to all the stuff we're doing. And I added one agenda item so far, which was just to recap the OBO or the OB material processing session. I can't remember which of you were actually sitting in on that session. It was mostly our group plus two from OB besides myself. And that was really good. It was really good because of the energy that they have, a couple of people there have in wanting to push forward this whole material processing branch. So I could launch into a summary of that right away. Is that what people would like? I can't remember who of you didn't make it. Troy, can't hear you.
Sorry, thanks. I'm wondering if maybe all of us were there, and therefore we don't need a recap.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know. There was lots.
I'm looking at the names, and I think maybe we all were.
Okay, cool.
I guess I wasn't there actually.
Okay.
Today I'll be in discussion. I wasn't there. So
okay, well, I can offer a recap in like 3 sentences. All right, so the OB folks spearheaded a material processing class underneath planned process. And that was very much meant to include and does include material combination and material separation. They are aware of, since that was created, they are aware of some of the nuanced problems of identity when you're combining things. What's the identity of the output? Is it supposed to be linked to the identity of one particular input or varieties? So Sebastian, one of the newer OB heads, and somebody who's, I think, employed full-time to be an ontologist, has time to look into this. And he brought forward the idea that we should be picking, there are two kinds of material combination process, and in one of them, the identity of one input sort of carries forth to the output. So if I got some corn and I'm salting and buttering it, the output is corn with salt and butter, but we want to attach the corn identity from the input corn to the output. Now, that's an interesting thing. It's in philosophy of logic, pure logic around identity. The whole thing about it is you have either these, I think they call them phasals, or entities which can undergo phases, that is, changes to them, and they don't change their identity. And then you've got another kind, I forget the exact name, existentials. What's the name for it? Phasals versus substantial. A substantial kind. These are the if I have a substantial kind in front of me, it has properties which can't change. If they change, then the identity of that thing changes. So Sebastian was kind of pursuing this phasal substantial kind in terms of his symmetry and asymmetry of inputs. Some inputs you want to call substantial, and other kinds of aspects of that input would be phasal, something like that. Anyway, I'm just trying to map over stuff there. Now, the whole problem with OWL identity, and this is what I wanted to get into because we have to kind of synchronize on thought there, is that if logically, regardless of where you fall in the phasal substantial question. If logically you're looking at an owl graph and you're trying to reason through it, and you have a relation, say, between me and the hairs on my head, part of, and I take a hair away, then technically I'm not the same person after I snipped off that hair. Logically, I am not the same person, and owl will raise a contradiction if I try to say that I am the same. And this literally looks like a knowledge graph where you've got an entity with one identifier, and they have has part some hair or has part a hair and not has part a hair at the end of the process, the barbershop process. So regardless of where you fall on that abstract substantial or phasal kind, owl itself and many reasoners will run into contradictions with any material processing if you're trying to say one of the inputs is the same as the output. So that's what Sebastian would run into on the logical front. And the only way I can see to simply solve this is to assign identifiers for process inputs and outputs. A corn of cob on the input has ID1, and the corn of cob on the output has ID2. But then we have another kind of ID that's sort of floating above the whole process horizon. And there we say this identifier, give it a label corn, points to or denotes some ID1 corn in one phase of its existence and some ID2 corn in its phase. And we're just calling that the same thing. But we get a choice. We get to say arbitrarily which things we call that corn and which not. Now, I think this will also plug in, Troy, to what you are looking for in terms of lot processing and batch processing, where we're combining IDs, things with IDs, and you're stamping them with another overall ID. And the overall ID carries along with the batch until it's split up, and then maybe you can't use that anymore. So we've got this whole registry of IDs that are coming and going out of existence, some of which we want to track, say, on a blockchain all the way through. We want to track them through industrial processes where parts of the batch are going off here and there, and you actually want the original batch number associated with the chunk that you remove from that, all those decisions. And as I mentioned to Troy this morning, there's a paper that somebody introduced to me 2 weeks ago that's all about IDs and batches of things or individual things. And it was like done 20 years ago. And as the first stab in the ontology world out of a fairly well-established Toronto group with Michael Grunninger as one of the lead heads. And you'll run into his, if you look him up more, you'll run into his process modeling framework in ontology driven. And it's a bit of an oversight for me that I didn't look more closely at that. I've sort of seen it and was aware of it, but didn't really dive into it. Although I should. So maybe I'll make it an objective to report out on that framework, say in a month or so. Okay. So, right. So to recap that OB material processing discussion, there's this notion that OB would be fine moving its material process upper level into COB or into some potentially standalone ontology, but they're more favoring COB for an upper level class of materials. And I'm totally fine with that too. So there would be another few meetings with them, Sebastian and Bjorn and a few others perhaps, to identify those classes that should move over. And we would take some of ours and move them over too. Thing for me is like most of these classes could be happening in a laboratory rather than a kitchen. So why do we hang on to any of them really? Stirring, shaking, all of those actions are actually generic. Only somewhere maybe they start double boiler cooking. Only then do you start to get into very specific food things.
Well, yeah, Damien, I think the topic you just raised about when we acknowledge that an entity is enduring versus we recognize that it should be identified as a different thing from before, pre and post. A lot of that distinction is different for food from how it would be in a laboratory. And we may choose to have assays where it's very important to track inputs and outputs at precision because that's the nature of the work. Whereas a food, adding salt to it is definitely important to know, but it does not change the identity of the thing from a cook's perspective, right? And so this notion of what matters to grant identity to is, as you say, from a reasoner, it has to be very precise and handled. But from how much of that we expose, how detailed we enable that to be tracked and so forth, probably is different, I think, in the food world from this identity perspective. And I think there's also a bunch of other reasons why the kinds of stirring that need to be acknowledged and worked through for cooking are different, have overlap with, but are not the same as the kinds of stirring you do in a lab. That would be my feeling.
Great. So we'll actually still hang on to some of the terms. Whisking.
Totally. And I hope that I'm going to make up numbers here just for the sake of illustration. The 12 different kinds of stirring that are relevant for food stirring are linkable and linked back to a sort of family called mix things around, which is generic and not food specific. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't exist in space absent of a bridge back to Cobb or what have you, but it's got food specific, versions, dare I say flavors, because those are useful for the world of food.
Yep. And in fact, if this process ontology group, say that's OB and Cobb and us and others, maybe we're being boxed that we think, oh, we need to leave the food version processes out of it. Actually, maybe it will take in all varieties. The curators will be happy to take in food specific stirring terms as well as others that are happening in the laboratory. So that may be a moot distinction about where the term goes.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay.
Damien, what do you think is the next step on the proposal that the OB folks made to have these different classes of mixing processes, the sort of symmetric and asymmetric, as they called it, or sort of phasal versus substantial? What are they going to do next, or are we supposed to input on something?
I've been meaning to have a conversation with Sebastian. I think that his approach to try to identify some processes that preserve the symmetry versus asymmetry and try to identify certain inputs as symmetric versus not. It can be helpful, and there's a certain logic that might help some stuff there, but it makes very complex the people having to think about which processes they might choose, even though it's the same process, a mixing process where it's only the ratios of the things going in that make you start to think that the identity of the one input is preserved in the output or not. Like making muffins with all these different things, you wouldn't say that's still bran.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably it's not appropriate for us at the moment to talk about what we think the better answer here is. I mean, I definitely have opinions about it, but maybe there's consensus in this group that we have opinions that we would like to help inform this debate.
Right. Okay. So what I was winding around to is I would have a conversation with him just to ascertain whether those kind of problems are recognized or seen. My guess is I will propose to him that we at least need this arbitrary ability to maintain identifiers across the processes for inputs and outputs at a more abstract level. After that iteration of ideas, I think he will come back with Bjorn with a proposal. And I think it would still have these categories, but it's just, we may not be populating our hierarchy of processes much with underneath those categories. So that's just a prediction. Anyway, in general, process wise, one iteration, and then back again with our whole group to think about that. And you could say that, yes, the general problem is one of identity. What do we offer people in the modeling world for maintaining or distinguishing identity through addition of materials or subtraction of materials or changing the upper level classes. So I can see why we'd want to do that iteration and then get back to how to define these upper level classes. Material addition and subtraction, and as one of our people suggested, just transformation, taking an input and changing it in shaping it before outputting it again. So I'll follow up with Sebastian and see when he's ready to iterate back to us.
Cool. I think maybe just to maintain the sort of spirit and the rhythm of what this group has been working on, maybe the appropriate thing here would be to talk internally, so inside this group, food specific, about where we think this idea of phasal change versus substantial change, where do we think it belongs in a process ontology? And then we could bring that as maybe not something soft to the recommendation, an input, a perspective to OB and say, look, the food people think that maybe the best way to handle it is this way, or at least that would serve their interests the best. Now, please consider, I'm thinking that might be the best way to handle is that we try and form a point of view on this concept. And one solution could be that it is an upper level taxonomic distinction. In other words, there are processes that are phasal and processes that are substantial. It could also be an attribute of the inputs. It could be an attribute of the combination process, or the process of inputting things. There could be inputting and there could be just contributing, so to speak, et cetera. Right? There's a bunch of different ontological resolutions to this important idea. I think, in a large group, small group, one person, I don't know, it might be useful for us to form a response, if you will, a suggestion or an input to that OB level discussion on this dimension. And by the way, in other dimensions, but this one was put on the table, and I think we are capable of formulating our sort of consensus best idea about how to handle that from a food perspective.
Great. Yeah. So we could easily spend another deep dive or a session or two of our group on that subject, I think, especially as it may have implications over on the food science side when they're trying to keep track of experimental stuff, as well as food production. And maybe we intuitively don't think it will show up in the kitchen that much, but is there a way to define when identity in kitchen automation might actually be super important? I'm always thinking acid test is robotics, right? If a robot can't figure out what our recipe is doing, then we clearly haven't brought the detail down enough. to cover that.
Yep.
And
Magali, I'm looking at your chat point here. I think you're kind of taking this where my mind is going as well, which is the symmetry asymmetry could be an attribute of the action. It's a symmetric action. It's an asymmetric action. It could also be an attribute of the input, right? This is a thing which dissolves and sort of goes away from an identity perspective, versus this is a thing which endures as a defining feature of the resulting product. It could also be an attribute of the inputting process. So I'm doing a mix, and then I salt something. And salting, by definition, is a asymmetric or symmetric input, right? These are all different possibilities of how we handle this, and I think it's good to talk through. I mean, maybe we're actually starting to do it now, and maybe that's a good use for this working session. I wasn't quite expecting it, but this could be a good place to do it. My gut says it's more complicated than a half hour, but it is solvable in an hour and a half. And it's solvable. I mean, to drive sort of broad consensus here. And it has a little bit, as you said, to do, Damien, with how reasoners work. It has a little bit to do with how a robot would interpret things. Has a little bit to do with what a cook would think. It has a little bit to do with what the existing process ontologies we've been looking at, what they already sort of are assuming about handling this, how much they have to be stretched to do this. All possible.
Right. And I think we may have to stratify our position based on those different use cases. Some don't need the identity and philosophy around that, and others do. So a sophisticated response will have those nuances.
Cool. We have a small number of very macro processes: material combination, material separation, the heating and cooling one, I forget what it's called, and maybe something else. And I love this cut. Like, we always come back to these. These are really, this is I think just a really useful way to start by breaking up the universe of all possible actions. And it's not exactly, this doesn't belong exactly and only in the combination one, but I think that's the one where it comes up most loudly. There's a similar thing about cutting, right? Whether the slice is different from the whole. But I think this sort of symmetric asymmetric is really it's mostly a material combination kind of thing, and so I kind of want to go there. Right? I kind of want to have a materials combination hat on for thinking about this question, and separately the cutting, the slicing thing, and is the slice different from the whole? To me, that feels like a slightly different question. It's kind of related, but it's philosophically just maybe a little bit distinct. Long story short, I guess I'm kind of feeling like it would be practical and useful for us as a working group to either split up or at least have these different sort of modes of discussion to sometimes tackle combination. Like, hey, today's a material combination discussion. And the conversation we had about cutting and slicing and chopping, whatever, it just feels, it feels very different. And like there are this other big process of just like moving something, storing, packing, handing off, that kind of thing, just feels just totally different. And so I sort of feel like it's useful for us to sort of signpost, both in terms of expectation settings for these meetings. Hey, this is gonna be mostly about combination today, and here's within combination, here's the topic we're gonna tackle. And maybe also over time, we get a little bit of specialization within this group. People sort of gravitate, at least for a short period of time, to kind of go deep on a topic. And by topic here, I mean one of those major processing categories. I'm just kind of feeling that although they are not the only way to view the world, totally acknowledge that, I think they might be a useful organizing mechanism for us as a working group. Just a thought.
Yeah. My response to that is, in terms of, say, topics like identity, the material combination and separation are sort of a duality that identity will cross. So we may find the subject is identity and material combination, or identity and separation, and have those back to back or within the same meeting. Other folks? I'm curious, in terms of the IC Foods folks. I know you guys have a project on food product format, shipping formats, and so on. So I presume this kind of discussion plugs right into that. And I mentioned, like, hey, it would be great if GS1 knowledge graph / barcoded identity around that, if we could actually approach that from an ontology perspective. I think you were wondering, Troy, if there was an ontology out there for formats and packages of things, and maybe there is, I don't know of, but I could see why that would be like a separate workable work item. I don't know if you guys can stick a student on that GS1 / food packaging / ontology space.
Yeah, we're not quite there yet. We're definitely we've got conversations happening with with GS1 and with the Produce Traceability Initiative, and a few others in that space. A lot of the standardization is not even so much around the type of packaging, but around the pack size. And there could be some interesting things there. I'll just give you a one example. You don't sell lettuce by weight, you sell it by the head. Whereas apples you sell by weight. And the reason you don't sell lettuce by weight is because it's packed in ice, and the water content of that lettuce is variable. And so the unit of measurement matters as a result of the end product that you're getting. So I think that there are some ontology aspects we could get into. The question becomes, how relevant is it for industry to uptake? And how is ontology going to make their lives better? And I don't really have an answer for that yet in this particular instance. And until we have a technology platform that, and we're also building this with Icicle, but until we have a technology platform that can translate at a conversational level something that a produce floor manager is saying to his watch or whatever he's saying or she's saying it into, and translate that into a controlled vocabulary, whether it's an ontology or a taxonomy or some other kind of controlled vocabulary, such that it becomes more computable. Until that level of functionality exists, ontology in this space is, I'm not going to say meaningless, but I don't think it's going to get much in the way of uptake. And so these things need to co-evolve with each other, and we're doing our best to co-evolve them such that we're not doing work that we think is important, but it's not paid for, right? It's always helpful when people are willing to put their money behind something, because then you know that they actually need it. But yeah, I mean, it's happening, but it's not happening, I think, at the pace that that we would like to think it would happen. And it's certainly not happening at the pace of getting a bunch of domain scientists together to talk about unifying their field of inquiry, because we're not talking about scientists here. We're talking about floor managers in grocery stores and their supervisors and managers and things like that. And so it's a different it's a different cat skin, as it were.
Yeah. Okay, I can see that. it's easy enough to incorporate it, make a standard out of a table of different formats, or produce times format, and you don't have to get into the knowledge graph ontology world.
Well, but different people do it different ways in different places too. And so, yeah, I mean, the one place where it is useful is in places like local and regional food hubs and things like this, where we want to elevate the ability for small food systems actors to be able to make decisions. I've got a bushel of apples here, a bag of apples there, and a barrel over here, and they've all are measured differently. That challenge is quite interesting to us. Figuring out the right folks who will pay for that, because a single food hub is not going to pay for that. And so there's a challenge pushing back against, well, I mean, when it comes to local and regional food systems, it's still largely word of mouth, pen and paper, or WhatsApp. At least in other countries, it's WhatsApp, not in the United States so much, but it's still largely not digitized and not tracked.
Okay. All right. So in terms of the food processing, the material separation and combination, we academics can like play around with some solutions about aggregates, aggregate entities, and the membership relations, and then the mass relations and measuring, which I have to do anyway for sampling, food
Right.
safety sampling. All of that stuff is being described. And then the nutritionists need it as well for their 100-gram samples of X, Y, or Z. So maybe we get to offer up a solution indirectly by working on the biosample angle.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. That's right. We want to do that, but I think we also want to do this with an eye of being relevant for people in kitchens. And if it's overly engineered, if we're putting in classifications that are logically coherent and academically interesting, but irrelevant to a chef, then I think we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
If we want uptake by people in kitchens.
Yeah.
Robert probably has more to say about that than I do.
I agree. I echo what you say. Yeah, I think you're spot on.
I'll just say from doing the recipe work in Sherbrooke, it's my main mission to create a filter button or report output that transforms into whatever more abstract level that is pertaining to a community of user, that skips all the details, that merges and joins and skips the identifiers and all of that. That will be my favorite experimental playground in the next year. We'll be going down that direction. But actually, what would help then, and this kind of circles back again to these use cases, is that we should probably define, if we can, going along in this process, the users, their level of need. And like, I think we all have kind of an intuitive understanding. You just look at a recipe and it doesn't mention identifiers and plurality and object aggregates of carrots and so on. Like, we already know that that's not how recipes are cast. So
I guess I'd like to spin just slightly what you said, Damien. I like everyone here, I'm keen that the output here is usable by various groups. I actually don't think the most helpful user for us to have in mind in this session is a cook. I actually think a more useful, I think it's more useful for us to think about something slightly more industrial. slightly more at scale, slightly more robotic, and so forth. Maybe not all the way to like, you know, self-cooking robot of the future, but an industrial process where something needs relatively structured input. And I'm thinking here, Kai, I'm actually thinking about you and USDA. So we know the USDA, Kai, because you said it, has some needs in this regard. There's a certain level of granularity, a certain sort of catalog of processing terms that the USDA would like to have amended, would like to see eventually, something like that. And I think that level of detail, that level of technicality is a really useful one for us to keep in mind in this ontology work. And I guess, Kai, I'm just kind of wondering, if you don't mind, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering how, what's your take on what the USDA wants and needs these days with regard to food processing terms, and what kind of guidance that ought to be giving this working group?
Well, I can just say, first of all, I can't speak for all of USDA because USDA is an enormous institution with lots and lots of different, people doing lots of different things. I can try to speak for USDA Food Data Central, which is the centralized repository that hosts various data types that, like this SR legacy data, which people here might be familiar with. So maybe more from our perspective, and again, I'm not the one to speak on behalf of the group. I'll just try to give my perspective. We're still in the process of trying to get our own data to be interoperable with each other, and also lay the foundation for that to make it interoperable with data sets provided by external sources. Whether or not we ever host data from external sources on FDC, that's a topic of great discussion. My personal opinion is I would like to see that, but that's not USDA's opinion. And so I think that it would be really helpful to have, so for example, in the work that we're doing with the food composition checklist, where we're kind of pioneering how to make our data interoperable, we kind of just took the examples of what this group is working on and just kind of put that into an enumeration set of process terms that we say, okay, when people are annotating their data, please use one of these things. So I think in the long run, it'd be really useful to have that mapped off to an ontology. In the short term, though, like just even like a list of what different people mean by different processing states or phases can be really helpful. So I think that's something that we look forward to more community engagement on. In terms of covering our own bases, there's like probably not so many terms, but then again, we're always looking for better ways of annotating up our own data as we do foundation food sampling. So with the SR legacy data, as people probably are familiar, the data is kind of like a big grab bag of, the description of the data is a big grab bag of like everything possible. It might have been processed, it might have been fresh, it might have been frozen, it might have been raw, it might have been canned, whatever. All that stuff is kind of crammed into a string. So we're kind of hoping to formalize that a little bit more thoroughly within the checklist. Like I said, with kind of an enumeration set. I can talk more about that later if you want, but I don't want to take too much of the group time. But basically, that is something that is helpful to USDA to have those kind of lists. So like I said, we're kind of like pulling from what this group has already produced. But it would be better to have that in some sort of formal ontology for the future. But for now, it's sufficient because in LinkML, you can map two ontologies pretty easily based on enumeration sets of strings. So yeah, long and short answer. I hope that answers your question, maybe not, but.
So I just want to follow up on that. You've got how many processes do you think you have there in your set? Ballpark.
In the dozens at the moment, like a couple dozen or maybe less. I can't remember exactly. I just pulled it in recently just to kind of demo it. It's not the official thing that USDA has endorsed. It's just a demo of what would be needed to comprehensively describe food.
I think starting with the processes that most interest the USDA is actually a great place to start. And I would think across different branches, because I know, for instance, John, who I think is now retired, was really interested in various production processes. So if we look at how do we make milk, how do we make milk? Where do we go back to? Well, we go all the way back to what do we feed the cow, right? Is that part of a food processing? Well, it kind of is the processing of the milk, right? Like, because the cow is deconstructing that material into. So and we have to ask ourselves those questions too, like where does the food processing actually begin? But I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole there with the milk example, but my main point is that if we start with foods that are or processes that are of concern to USDA, and we can enumerate them and blow them apart a little bit, and show how they're related to each other, and show things like, what does homogenization do to the milk fat globule membrane, and how does that affect human health? Those kinds of things, where we're looking at the processes that we do on foods, particularly, as Troy mentioned, the industrial processes that actually negatively impact human health. That would be a really interesting place to start as well. I would think the USDA would want to be interested in that.
Yeah, I think that long term it probably would be, but would need to be kind of shown that that's a value. So at the moment, I think the idea with the checklist project is really to just kind of get a minimum information standard set that can be used to describe foundation foods, SR legacy, and experimental foods, because there are probably some people doing studies who are already published in experimental foods or would like to be published within experimental foods that are maybe addressing questions similar to what you just said. And so having kind of the metadata.
Yeah, that's my point.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And having the metadata for that within a standard would be really great. Doesn't mean it all needs to be ontologized right away, but I think that would be helpful. The thing is that with there's a lot going on, so that's not necessarily the top USDA priority, but if people here want to help support that effort, of course, we would appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that's really if we could find a way to get a list from USDA of the top 10 or top 50, or pick your number, processes that impact health in some way, and the top 10 or 50 or whatever that impact sustainability in some way, and then to be able to work from there as sort of high priority terms, that gives us a natural a way to prioritize which kinds of processes we should be thinking about and how we slot them into this greater architecture of a food processing ontology and standardization.
I think to get specific processes like that, it might be necessary to talk to beyond just the group that I'm in within ARS, like the ERS and other USDA agencies might have different answers. I'm not connected with all those folks, so I'm not exactly sure how the best way to get that answer would be, but I will look into it. I'll try to look into it. That might not be such a simple question. Hey, USDA, what processes are you interested in? It really depends who you ask. Right, like there's going to be a lot of different players.
I understand. I understand, but getting the top 10 from each of the branches, or representatives from each of the branches, would give us a nice list to go after.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, if someone were to say to me, look, from my part of the agency, here's the terms that we've got, and I would like a better version of this. Or off the top of my head, here are some examples of terms in the processing that we use a lot that are useful to us. So the rest of this kind, please, right? That can be a pretty vague prompt to get started. But I think actually as a working group, we could do a lot with that.
I think one obvious thing I could see moving forward would be to kind of parse through SR legacy and foundation food labels to, kind of bag of words to find all processes that are in there and then kind of produce a list. I think that might be easier than trying to ask around with ERS and ARS and different people that I don't know. Yeah.
Is an extract of those legacy terms easy to create? I would think it might be.
Yes, I'm currently working on a project with that for USDA, so I already have the text. So in theory, I'll just have to look into exactly what the best way to do that would be, but in theory, that could be something I can try and do. So I will put that as an action item for myself to attempt to do that. No promises that it'll work, but I will try to do that.
Cool. And Kai, if you're able to, I volunteer to take the next step, which is to say, okay, given this sort of bag of terms from legacy, here's maybe what we might go and do from here, right? And bring that to this group as a proposal. You know, these kind of terms need refinement. These we don't know what to do with. These actually are good seeds for creating other stuff. You know, whatever. Just to sort of like do some preliminary thinking to tee up group discussion here. I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, sure. I'll see if I can get it to work. I'll share the results with you and others and see if that list is helpful in any way.
Yeah, Magali, I think that's exactly right. That's where we're going with this from the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the SR legacy sample descriptions in the labels, and we're going to be running into boiled. I don't know if we'll run into hydrogenated.
Chopped, whole, skinned. Right. I mean, all these things. Yeah,
we have all sorts of things, and Foodon also has a list of similar things as well.
Hydrogenated is super important. I don't know, why wouldn't you want to get hydrogenated? I mean, that's...
Oh, no. All I'm saying is you might not run into hydrogenated, but it could be very important. So, Matthew, your point about really deep diving into milk and hydrogenation and what happens from a health perspective might not line up with what these sample design things are. We have to certainly have to formalize all of those processes just mentioned in this, potentially in SR legacy.
I just to be clear, I said homogenization, not hydrogenation.
Oh, sorry. Okay, well, whatever. Okay. That's what I meant. But the deep dive to prove the case for research may not show up in this SR legacy list. We would have to add some layers down to get to the research gold after getting these SR legacy process list.
Like hydrogenated is in there, like a lot of oils we sampled. SR legacy has a lot of sampled hydrogenated oils, but homogenize doesn't seem to be in there. So that's just an example right there.
Right. I mean, homogenization, the jury is still out, and the scientific evidence is still, being gathered about what the hell is going on when we homogenize with milk fat globule membrane. But hydrogenation, the evidence is clear. Like that's bad, right? Like, so, I mean, it's shelf stable, but it's not good for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I will try and put together that list for people to look at, and hopefully that's helpful.
And Kai, even if it's a partial list, like for this chunk of the data universe, I have some stuff, and there's a bunch I didn't get to. I think the point here is not to create the authoritative output set or anything like that, but rather just to put in some seed material. I hope that's okay for me to use that term, for this group's working, so that we are, as we are working on sort of top-down, more philosophical and deeply technical things, we're grounding it in getting along the way to outputs that a very important user group has expressed an interest in. That's sort of my thinking. Cool.
Okay, so we've got 8 minutes left. Do we want to just bullet list some topics for the next Zooms, and we won't commit to what order they're in, but just try to finger in the air, decide how the conversation will evolve this fall.
Maybe should we pop them into the notes of this thing, just to save you a transcription, and it'll be more
this is what I'm doing. Yeah, I've got the document going here.
Okay, all right, you're doing the transcription for us. Cool.
I'm doing a bit of it. I was just going to propose that other people are free to chip in with little comments, because I can't catch everything. I'm slow typing even my own thoughts into it. So I welcome everyone else adding to the document directly.
Cool. And help me find the right spot here really quickly.
Yeah, page. Oh, I don't have the pages on here. Insert page number. Page numbers. Okay, done. Page 6, bottom.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is in the discussion and action portion of today's meeting. No.
Discussion action, bottom. Yeah.
Not sure why Google decided that my text needs to be green. I'm not trying to be special.
I'm curious, Magali, if there's any in the coming months, if there are any particular topics that intersect with your group's work that need addressing from an OVO Foundry perspective.
I'm not an expert in all. You can't hear me? Yes, it's okay.
Oh.
Yes, you hear me?
I
Can
now hear
me?
you. It was my problem.
Okay. So I think this is very interesting to exchange and to discuss about what you said about OBI and symmetric versus asymmetric changes, but also to link with the food process branches. So this is my special interest to discuss, but my group is not. I am working with my own model as PO2 transformer, but I think it is very interesting to know if we can perhaps represent things with the same formal level. So it is very important for me, at least, to be here.
Okay.
But anyway, the other topic will be to make the mapping between and to follow the discussion with USDA versus FoodX2 modeling. But I think we are very close together, so we are going in the right direction, I think, with Kai and your proposal for food transformation process. And I don't know really what is if there is a so huge difference between cooking as a chef or cooking as in an industrial process, but just to describe the thing, to describe the event or the quantity or the temperature or the condition, I think we are close, but perhaps it is in the level of granularity, just as you mentioned before, that we should be careful. I don't know, Robert, if you have a different opinion, I guess. What is your opinion?
Summarize the question for me. I'm happy to answer.
I don't know what is the difference. There's a big difference between home cooking or industrially made cooking recipe. You know, what is your opinion? Because I think it is just in the level of details, in the granularity, just as
Yeah,
I don't know.
There's a few things. I think I would almost divide it into 3 levels, where there's home cooking, right? Cooks cooking. There's
Cooking.
chefs in food service, and then there's manufacturing in an environment. And there's food service and there's industrial, let's call it for now. So I think those are very different. Do the thermodynamics change in any of them? Sometimes because of the mass. 2,
Yes,
I think
I agree.
one of the most important distinction is the equipment that's used at each one. So when you say whisk, that could mean, is it a balloon whisk? And those make huge differences and completely change the process and the result of what design, what style, what size, all those. So I think they're pretty significantly different.
Yes, but it is depending on the devices, I think, not so
More so
much
than
on
anything.
the recipe itself.
More so than anything, because if you're caramelizing something and browning sugars, or there's the Maillard reaction, that is a scientific process that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
In
It's a phenomenon.
It's a phenomenon that's happening in any place. I agree. It's often the physical and thermal dynamics, I think, are the 2, if that's the right way to say it, that really change. But scientifically, what's happening in there, it's as variant as a 2-quart saucepan to a 1-gallon saucepan within a home kitchen, from a 1-gallon saucepan to
the scaling effect. It's a scaling. It is a very important question in the scientific domain also. It is a very big question to address. Yes.
Right. And for practicality, some things scale, like sodium scales somewhat directly, but colorants and spices do not. So that's a big difference.
Really?
Yes, I agree. I agree with you.
Yeah. You don't use the same percentage as you multiply by 10 of the colorant of annatto or whatever it may be, because there's I don't know what the right word is. There's a cumulative effect, I think is the right word, of colors and some other spices and stuff. Where salt, 0.75 to 1.25 is kind of the general range of acceptability, percentage-wise. Yeah.
And that's why also I have mentioned in the chat that I didn't agree with Matthew when he said that we have the causality, we have something positive or negative, we have negative or positive process. It is not so easy to know when it is positive and when it is negative effect. So I will be very careful about this also.
Yeah. Also, lettuce is sold by the pound sometimes, not, and it's not packed. I mean, sometimes ice, sometimes not. And even though there's a case of 40 pieces and they market it as per piece, there's a weight range it must be required to be in. So it's sold by both weight and piece, actually. It's not one or the other, it's kind of both in some instances. And lettuce that's bulk, or like, is by the pound, the ounce, the gram. So there's a lot of yeah.
You just pop one of those examples of both by weight and by count into the discussion.
Yes.
My big realization,
Right.
Sherbrooke, I'll say
Thank
goodbye
you.
in a moment, but one last thing. I realized how much the cleanup of the devices is the hidden part of all these recipes.
Oh,
like
you mean of actually actually cleaning the system before the next?
preparing, that's actually the hidden mirror world of this whole cooking endeavor.
Oh, yeah. An
Yeah.
example of that also, Damien, to build on that, is the clean in place systems, the piping that they use to pipe things, and dependent on the style, the volume loss and
Right.
shear,
Right.
right? If you pipe it this far, use a different starch than if you pipe it this far.
Ah,
Because
wow.
there's the shear ability. Does it last? Or do you just need to get it from one kettle to another? Or do you just send it to the other side of the plant? Completely different.
And that's where the industrial side of a recipe.
And it might change the ingredient, not just the equipment.
Completely shifts. Yeah.
Well,
So I have learned that there is at least three levels, three scaling, homemade cooking in a restaurant.
food service.
We'll say
Food service.
food services, and then industrial.
Industrial. Yeah.
Fine.
That's kind of that's the three general categories accepted.
Yes.
Mhm. Okay, great. You know to that.
Take care, everyone. Be
All
well.
right. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
See you.